There are moments in history when a single choice, made in absolute darkness, saves hundreds of lives. This is the story of one of those moments, a night in 1865, when a young Lakota scout named Eagle Feather faced an impossible decision: light a forbidden fire and violate sacred law during the most holy time of year, or stay silent and let 800 of his people die in their sleep. What he chose that night would echo through generations, becoming a teaching story about when rigid tradition must bend to preserve life itself. But to understand why that choice mattered, we need to go back 10 months earlier, to a cold November morning when the world learned what happened when native peoples had no warning at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. November 29th, 1864. Sand Creek, Colorado Territory. Colonel John Chivington led 700 soldiers in a dawn attack on a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho camp, flying an American flag and a white flag of truce. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. Women and children cut down as they ran, infants killed in their mothers' arms, bodies mutilated after death in ways that shocked even hardened frontier soldiers who later testified before Congress. When the smoke cleared, over 150 native people lay dead, 2/3 of them women and children. The warriors had been away hunting. There had been no warning, no time to run, no chance to save anyone. News of Sand Creek spread across the Great Plains like wildfire, carried by survivors, by traders, by the wind itself, it seemed. Among the Lakota camps scattered across what would become Montana and Wyoming, the story arrived with a particular horror because it answered a question no one wanted to ask. What would we do if they came for us in the night? The answer at Sand Creek had been nothing. They had done nothing because they could do nothing. By the time anyone knew the soldiers were there, it was already over. Young Eagle Feather was 17 that winter when his grandfather, Standing Bear, returned from a council where Cheyenne survivors had testified. The old man did not speak for 3 days. When he finally called his grandson to his lodge, his voice carried a weight Eagle Feather had never heard before. Standing Bear described what the survivors had seen, and then he said something that would haunt Eagle Feather for the rest of his life. They had no warning. If one fire had burned on the hills, if one rider had reached them an hour before dawn, half of those children would be alive today. We must never, never be caught sleeping. That winter of 1864 into 1865, something remarkable happened across Lakota territory. It was not ordered by any single chief. It was not planned at any grand council. It emerged the way solutions sometimes do among people who share the same nightmare. Village by village, camp by camp, the Lakota began building a warning system. They chose high points, places where fire could be seen for miles. They stationed young men with sharp eyes and fast horses. They established protocols. 3 fires meant soldiers approaching. 4 fires meant imminent attack. 1 continuous flame meant danger of unknown nature, but requiring immediate action. They created predetermined meeting points where scattered bands would gather if villages had to be abandoned. They practiced. They drilled their children. They made readiness a way of life. By spring of 1865, this network stretched across hundreds of miles of territory. Eagle Feather earned his place as a firekeeper on a hill overlooking the Tongue River Valley, where 7 Lakota villages had gathered for the summer hunting season. It was an honor and a responsibility that suited his temperament. He was patient. He was vigilant. He understood that hours of watching nothing happen was the price of being ready for the one moment when everything happened at once. But he did not yet understand how cruel the choices could become. That lesson was coming. General Patrick Connor understood that native peoples were adapting. The colonel, who had taken over frontier military operations in the months after Sand Creek, was a man who believed in overwhelming force and total war. That summer of 1865, he assembled something the plains had never seen: a three-pronged campaign with 2,500 soldiers, supported by Pawnee scouts who knew the land and hated the Lakota with a generations-old fury. Connor's orders were explicit and would later become infamous. "You will not receive overtures of peace or submission from Indians, but will attack and kill every male Indian over 12 years of age. No prisoners, no mercy, no hesitation." Connor's scouts had located the Lakota camps along the Tongue River, 7 villages, roughly 800 people, a significant target. He planned his approach with cold precision, marching his main force of 2,000 men at night when dust would not betray them, when the signal fire system would be blind. He scheduled his arrival for late August, specifically during the White Buffalo Calf Woman ceremony time, when he knew from his Pawnee scouts that sacred law forbade night fires. The Lakota would be vulnerable, and Connor intended to exploit that vulnerability completely. What Connor did not know, what he could not know, was that on a hill above those sleeping villages, a 17-year-old scout was about to face a choice that no one should ever have to make: a choice between sacred law and survival, between honoring the spirits and saving his people, between the rules that had guided the Lakota for generations and the brutal reality of this particular moment in this particular war. Eagle Feather's watch post overlooked 7 villages of sleeping families. In just a few hours, if he did nothing, those families would experience their own Sand Creek. But if he lit his signal fire during the sacred prohibition time, he would be violating spiritual law in a way that could cut him off from his people forever. Some choices do not have good options. They only have less terrible ones. And sometimes, in the darkness, you have to decide which rules matter more than life itself. August 28, 1865. Connor's force was moving, and Eagle Feather had just spotted them in the moonlight. Eagle Feather had been trained to see in darkness. Every firekeeper learned to read moonlight on metal, to distinguish between deer moving through brush and men moving with purpose, to count horses by the rhythm of their hoofbeats carried on night wind. What he saw now, from his position on the ridge above the Tongue River, made his stomach turn to ice. A column of soldiers stretching back into the darkness like a serpent. Not dozens, not hundreds. He counted by sections, by the way moonlight caught on rifle barrels and saddle fittings, roughly 2,000 men, moving in disciplined silence toward 7 sleeping villages. He knew immediately what this was. Everyone on the plains knew General Connor's reputation. Everyone had heard the stories of his orders. No prisoners, no mercy. Every male over 12. Which meant the younger boys too. Which meant this was not war as the Lakota understood it. This was extermination. The matches were in his hand before he consciously decided to reach for them. His kindling was laid out, always ready, always prepared. 3 strikes, and he would have flame. 3 strikes, and the signal fire would roar to life, visible for 20 miles in every direction. 3 strikes, and the next keeper would see it and light their fire, and the chain would spread across the night like stars coming down to earth. 3 strikes, and 800 people would have a chance to live. But his hand froze. Because it was late August. Because the White Buffalo Calf Woman ceremony time had begun 3 days ago. Because sacred law, law that had governed his people since the beginning times, absolutely forbade night fires during this holiest period. The fires might offend the spirits, they might drive away the sacred buffalo, they might bring catastrophe upon the people. Every child learned this, every adult obeyed it. There were no exceptions. There had never been exceptions. Eagle Feather looked down at the villages. He could not see individual lodges in the darkness, but he knew they were there. He knew Yellowbird Woman's lodge was in the 2nd village, where she was nursing her infant daughter. He knew the boy Fast Elk, who was only 13 but already showing the makings of a warrior, slept in the third village with his grandparents. He knew Standing Bear, his own grandfather, was in the largest village at the center, probably sleeping with one hand on his medicine bundle as he always did. 800 people, 800 lives. And in perhaps 2 hours, when false dawn gave Connor enough light to see, those lives would end the way they had ended at Sand Creek. He knelt on the ridge, matches still in his hand, and did something that would later become part of the story. He prayed, not the formal prayers of ceremony, but the desperate prayer of a young man facing an impossible choice. He spoke to White Buffalo Calf Woman. He spoke to Wakan Tanka, the great mystery. He said, "Grandmother, I know the law. I have honored it all my life. But I see soldiers coming to murder our people in their sleep. I see children who will die if I do nothing. If I am wrong to light this fire, let the punishment fall on me alone. Let me be cut off. Let me be outcast. But please, please, let this fire save them." Then he struck the match. The first one failed, blown out by wind. The second caught, and he touched it to the kindling with hands that shook so badly he almost dropped it. The flame hesitated, then caught, then spread. In 30 seconds the signal fire was blazing, a column of flame visible for miles, announcing to anyone watching that danger was coming, that death was on the move, that it was time to run. Eagle Feather had no way of knowing if anyone was watching. The firekeepers at the next stations might be asleep, trusting that sacred law meant no fires would burn tonight. But he had done what he could do. He had made his choice. He had broken sacred law to try to save his people. Now it was in the hands of the spirits and whatever firekeepers might be awake. What happened next became legendary. At the next fire station, 7 miles east, a keeper named Grey Wolf had stepped outside his shelter to relieve himself. He saw Eagle Feather's flame erupt into the night like a scream made of light. For one frozen moment, Grey Wolf stood paralyzed, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. A signal fire during the sacred prohibition. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. It was happening, which meant something was so wrong, so immediately catastrophic, that someone had chosen spiritual death over physical inaction. Grey Wolf lit his fire in under a minute. 7 miles further, another keeper saw Grey Wolf's flame and lit her own, then another, then another. The chain rippled across 40 miles of darkness in less than an hour, each keeper seeing the impossible fire and understanding immediately what it meant. Understanding that tonight survival trumped ceremony. But fires alone could not evacuate 800 people scattered across 7 villages. The system needed riders. At each fire station, designated runners mounted their fastest horses and raced toward the camps. They rode hard, pushing their animals to the edge of collapse, because they knew that minutes mattered. That each delay meant families trapped in their lodges when Connor arrived. The first rider reached the nearest the village at what we would now call 2:30 in the morning. He did not shout. Shouting carried. Instead, he went lodge to lodge, speaking urgently but quietly, waking families with the words every Lakota dreaded: "Soldiers coming, many soldiers. Pack what you can carry. Go now." The evacuation was not panicked. This was the difference between Sand Creek and the Tongue River. These people had prepared. They had practiced. Mothers woke children with gentle hands and urgent whispers. Fathers grabbed weapons and medicine bundles. The elderly, those who had prepared their spirits for this moment, insisted on walking under their own power, carrying sacred items over practical goods. One old woman, named Keeps the Fire, was seen leaving with nothing but a buffalo skull used in ceremonies, its weight nearly too much for her frail arms, refusing all offers to carry blankets or food instead. "The spirits matter more than my comfort," she said. "If I die cold, I die knowing we honored what matters." The warriors organized instinctively. They created false trails leading east when the villages were moving west. They scattered clothing and abandoned tools to make it look like panicked flight rather than organized withdrawal. They prepared ambush positions to slow any pursuit. They did everything right because they had thought about this, had planned for this, had learned from Sand Creek that preparation was the only defense against overwhelming force. Connor reached the villages at dawn. His timing had been perfect, his intelligence accurate, his approach flawless. Everything had gone according to plan, except when his lead elements crested the last ridge and looked down at the campsites. They saw nothing. Empty lodges, cold fire pits, not a single person, not a sound except wind moving through abandoned structures. Connor sat on his horse, staring at the empty villages with an expression his officers would later describe as absolutely murderous. He had marched 2,000 men through the night. He had planned this operation for weeks. He had brought enough ammunition to kill everyone twice over, and they were gone. His Pawnee scouts spread out, reading the signs. They found the tracks leading west, but they also found the false trails. They found scattered belongings, but not enough to indicate panic. Most tellingly, they found the remains of signal fires on the hills, fires that should not have existed during sacred time. One of the older Pawnee scouts, a man named Lone Wolf, examined Eagle Feather's fire station and understood immediately what had happened. He returned to Connor and explained in broken English that someone had broken sacred law to light the warning chain, that the villages had been warned hours ago, that they were probably 20 miles away by now, scattered across terrain that would make pursuit nearly impossible. Connor's rage was legendary. Officers reported that he screamed at his scouts, blaming them for not detecting the fire system. He cursed the Lakota for cowardice, as if organized retreat was somehow dishonorable. He gave the order that became his most famous quote, yelling at his gathered officers, "They vanished like smoke, like smoke." Then he ordered pursuit. He would not return empty-handed. He would not let this operation become a complete failure. His 2,000 men turned west, following trails that scattered and reformed, led by scouts who knew they were following people who knew this land far better than any army ever could. Behind them, the empty villages stood as a testament to one young man's terrible choice. Eagle Feather, watching from a distant ridge, saw the soldiers arrive at dawn, saw them find nothing, saw Connor's rage even from miles away, and for the first time since lighting that forbidden fire, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps the spirits understood, that perhaps sacred law was not as rigid as he had feared, that perhaps there were rules higher than the ones, written in ceremony. He would learn in the coming days whether his people agreed. Connor's pursuit lasted 9 days. 9 days of his 2,000 soldiers chasing ghosts through badlands and hidden canyons where the Lakota had prepared refuges long before this night. 9 days that revealed something remarkable about how a people organize themselves when survival depends on it. Because those 800 refugees were not just running, they were executing a plan that had been refined over months of preparation, a plan that turned their knowledge of the land into their greatest weapon. The predetermined meeting points were not random. They were places the Lakota had selected for their defensive advantages and their access to water. Natural fortresses where narrow approaches could be defended by a few warriors while families sheltered in protected valleys beyond. The first gathering point was a canyon system, 25 miles west of the Tongue River, a maze of arroyos and dead ends that the Lakota children knew like the rooms of their own lodges. Connor's scouts led his army straight into that maze and immediately realized their mistake. Every turn looked the same. Every canyon promised to open into a larger valley but instead narrowed to impassable walls. While Connor's men wandered, confused and increasingly frustrated, The Lakota families moved through passages the cavalry could not follow, traveling on foot through spaces where horses could not go. What happened in those refuges tells us something important about Lakota society. 800 people from 7 different villages, thrown together in crisis, created a functioning community almost immediately. They established shared childcare circles where mothers took turns watching children so others could rest or help with communal tasks. They organized silent games for the youngest children, teaching them to stay quiet through play rather than fear. When hunters brought down deer or elk, the meat was distributed equally regardless of which village you came from, regardless of your status before the evacuation. Standing Bear, Eagle Feather's grandfather, later said that those 9 days showed him what the people could become when survival stripped away everything except what mattered most. But survival required more than organization. It required sacrifice. On the 3rd day of pursuit, Connor's lead cavalry company pushed harder than the others, getting ahead of the main force, following fresh tracks that led toward Wolf Creek Canyon. They were getting close, too close. The families ahead needed time to reach the next refuge, but the canyon offered only one passage out, a narrow gap that funneled everyone through a natural choke point, which meant someone had to hold that passage. Someone had to buy time measured in hours, not minutes. 12 elderly warriors volunteered. Their names deserved to be remembered. Standing Bear, Lone Elk, Black Stone, Red Shield, Many Wounds, Bare Heart, White Thunder, Grey Fox, Strong Wind, Little Wolf, Sacred Pipe, and Walks at Night. The youngest was 61. The oldest was 74. They were men who had lived full lives, who had grandchildren in the fleeing columns, who understood mathematics better than Connor ever would. 12 old men with rifles and knowledge of terrain against a cavalry company of over 100 soldiers. The math was not in their favor, but math was not the point. They positioned themselves in the rocks above Wolf Creek Canyon, where the passage narrowed to barely 20 feet across. They had ammunition, water, and no illusions about survival. Before the cavalry arrived, they performed a brief ceremony. Not the full death song ritual, because there was no time, but something simpler and more direct. Each man stated his name, his clan, and his purpose. I am Standing Bear of the Bear Clan, and I stand here so my grandchildren can reach safety. I am Lone Elk of the Elk Clan, and I die here so others may live. 12 statements, 12 acceptances of what was coming. Then they settled into positions and waited. The cavalry company arrived at mid-morning, moving fast, confident in their numbers and their repeating rifles. The first shots from above caught them completely by surprise. 2 soldiers went down. The rest scattered, seeking cover in a canyon that offered very little. The officer in charge, a lieutenant named Morrison, quickly assessed the situation. Hostiles in elevated positions with clear fields of fire. The only way forward through a killing zone. The smart military decision would have been to wait for the main force, to bring overwhelming numbers. But Morrison was young and eager, and convinced that old Indians with single-shot rifles could not possibly hold out against trained cavalry. He ordered a frontal assault. It failed spectacularly. The 12 warriors knew every rock, every angle, every position where a soldier might think he had cover, but actually remained exposed. They fired with the patience of men who had hunted buffalo for 50 years, who understood that you do not waste shots, who could read terrain like white men read books. The cavalry fell back after losing 6 more men. Morrison ordered another assault. It failed again. By noon, the lieutenant had lost 12 soldiers with nothing to show for it, except the knowledge that the old men above him were not running out of ammunition as fast as he had hoped. What Morrison did not know, what he could not know from his position in the canyon, was that the 12 warriors were rotating their fire in a way that made them seem more numerous than they were. 3 would fire while 9 reloaded and repositioned. Then 3 different warriors would fire. The cavalry heard constant shooting and assumed they faced a larger force. It was a trick Standing Bear had learned fighting Crow raiders 40 years earlier. It worked just as well against the United States Army. The standoff lasted 6 hours. 6 hours during which the families behind Wolf Creek reached the next refuge and scattered into country where no army could follow without splitting into vulnerable small units. 6 hours that Connor's scouts later calculated had made the difference between possible capture and complete escape. Morrison finally received orders to pull back when the main force arrived, and Connor assessed the situation. The general recognized what the 12 warriors had done. He recognized it was now pointless. The families were gone. His window had closed, but he ordered his artillery to shell the positions anyway, because rage required some outlet. When the shells stopped falling and soldiers finally climbed to the defensive positions, they found 11 bodies and evidence that a 12th man had crawled away, probably to die elsewhere. They found scattered brass casings, carefully collected water bags, and a few personal items the warriors had brought to sustain them through their last day. One soldier later wrote in his diary about finding a parfleche bag containing dried meat and a child's small moccasin, obviously kept as a keepsake. He wrote that he suddenly understood these were not warriors in the conventional sense. They were grandfathers who had chosen death so their grandchildren could have life. The soldier kept the moccasin, he wrote, to remember that day, to remember what courage actually looked like. Connor's campaign continued for 3 more days, but his heart was no longer in it. His horses were exhausted. His men were demoralized by an enemy that would not stand and fight in open battle but would die by dozens to buy minutes for their families. His supplies were running low, stretched thin by pursuing an enemy that refused to be caught. On the 6th day, he ordered retreat. The official report would claim the campaign as a success, citing villages destroyed and enemy dispersed. But everyone who had been there knew the truth. Connor had spent roughly $2 million in modern currency to capture abandoned cookpots and worn teepee poles. He had killed 12 elderly men who had volunteered to die, and he had failed completely to accomplish his primary objective. Back in the refuges, word arrived that the pursuit had ended. The soldiers were gone. It was safe to begin the slow return to traditional territories. But before the camps dispersed, before families began the process of rebuilding what they had abandoned, the spiritual leaders called for a ceremony. Eagle Feather was summoned. He came expecting judgment, expecting to be cast out for his violation of sacred law. What he received instead changed his understanding of what sacred actually meant. The head elder, a man named Hollow Horn, spoke for the council. "You broke law to preserve life. You violated ceremony to save the people. There is a teaching in this." He gestured to the families gathered around. Do we keep law at the cost of those it was meant to protect? Or do we understand that the highest law is the preservation of the people themselves? The elders had debated this for 3 days while hiding from Connor. They had examined the question from every angle. Their conclusion was unanimous. Sacred law served the people. When law threatened to destroy what it was meant to protect, wisdom required adaptation. Eagle Feather had shown wisdom beyond his years. His forbidden fire had become a new teaching. Sometimes, the council declared, breaking the rules was the most sacred act possible. Eagle Feather wept. Not from relief, though relief was certainly part of it. He wept because he understood that he had been given something precious. He had been given permission to think rather than simply obey, to evaluate rather than automatically comply. And he had been given a burden, the burden of being the story that would be told to future generations when they struggled with similar questions. when they wondered whether tradition should ever bend, whether rules written in one time made sense in another. His choice, and the council's response to it, became teaching tools, became wisdom passed down through the decades, became part of what it meant to be Lakota in a changing world. Eagle Feather lived another 47 years after that night in August 1865, long enough to see his hair turn grey and then white, long enough to watch his grandchildren grow and have children of their own, long enough to become the kind of elder that young people sought out when they faced impossible choices. And throughout those decades, he carried the story of the forbidden fire not as a burden, but as a teaching tool, a way of helping his people navigate the brutal question that defined their age. How do you preserve who you are when everything around you demands that you change? The signal fire system did not end with Connor's failed campaign. It evolved. The network expanded and became more sophisticated, incorporating lessons learned from that August night. The Lakota added backup stations, created coded variations of the fire signals, and most importantly, they established a new protocol. During times of imminent threat, sacred prohibitions could be temporarily suspended by council decision. What Eagle Feather had done alone in crisis, the people formalized into practice. Survival did not require abandoning spirituality. It required understanding that spirituality served life, not the other way around. The system's finest hour came during Red Cloud's War, particularly in the events leading up to the Fetterman fight in December 1866. The signal fires detected troop movements from Fort Phil Kearny days before the army reached Lakota hunting grounds. Warriors had time to prepare, to set the ambush that would result in the complete destruction of Captain William Fetterman's command of 80 men. Military historians would later study Fetterman's defeat as a masterpiece of tactical coordination. But that coordination required something most analyses missed: advance warning, time to plan. The signal fire network provided both. Eagle Feather, now 22 and a respected warrior, helped maintain the watchposts that made the ambush possible. His forbidden fire had evolved into an accepted military asset, but systems designed to save lives have limitations, and Eagle Feather would live long enough to learn that terrible lesson. December 29th, 1890, Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota. By then, Eagle Feather was 62 years old, no longer a firekeeper but a recognized elder whose counsel carried weight. The Lakota had been confined to reservations for years, their traditional territories carved up and distributed to white settlers, their way of life systematically dismantled by government policy designed to, in the official phrase, kill the Indian and save the man. The ghost dance movement had spread across the plains, a desperate spiritual revival that promised the return of the buffalo and the restoration of the world as it had been. The government feared it, feared any gathering of native peoples, feared anything that looked like resistance. The 7th Cavalry, Custer's old unit hungry for revenge even 14 years after Little Bighorn, surrounded a band of Lakota ghost dancers at Wounded Knee Creek. Roughly 350 native people, mostly women and children, with only a few dozen men of fighting age. The cavalry positioned Hotchkiss guns on the surrounding hills. When a scuffle broke out during an attempt to disarm the men, the soldiers opened fire. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Hotchkiss guns cut down families as they ran. Women with babies were shot in the back. Children were killed as they tried to hide in ravines. When the shooting stopped, estimates ranged from 150 to 300 Lakota dead, buried eventually in a mass grave while a blizzard covered the ground with snow. Eagle Feather was not at Wounded Knee. He was at another camp, 60 miles away, when the news arrived. And the news came the old way, through riders and word of mouth, because no signal fire could have saved those families. They were already surrounded when the massacre began, already trapped, The system that had worked so brilliantly against Connor's night march was useless against an enemy that had corralled the people first and murdered them second. Eagle Feather understood immediately what Wounded Knee meant. It meant that adaptation only worked when you had room to maneuver, when you could run, when the enemy gave you any chance at all. Wounded Knee showed what happened when there was no chance, no escape, no possibility of warning making any difference. He spoke at a council 3 days after the massacre, and witnesses remembered his words for their stark honesty. I lit a forbidden fire once and saved 800 lives. I have taught that wisdom requires flexibility, that rules must sometimes bend. But there is a truth we must also teach. No signal fire can save you from an enemy that denies you space to run. No clever adaptation can overcome overwhelming force that surrounds you first. We survived Connor because we had land to disappear into. At Wounded Knee, they had nowhere to go. That is the difference between a people who are free and a people who are imprisoned. We must remember both lessons. Adapt when you can, fight when you must, but understand that sometimes the enemy leaves you no options at all. The decades after Wounded Knee were hard ones for the Lakota. Reservation life was designed to break them, to strip away their identity and replace it with something the government found more acceptable. The sun dance was banned. Traditional spiritual practices were outlawed. Children were taken to boarding schools, where speaking Lakota was punished, and native identity was treated as something shameful to be stamped out. Eagle Feather watched his people struggle with questions that made his choice about the signal fire seem simple. How much do you adapt to survive? At what point does survival cost so much that you lose what you were trying to preserve? When does flexibility become surrender? He answered those questions not with grand pronouncements but with how he lived. He learned English but spoke Lakota at home. He wore white man's clothing when required but kept his traditional items for private ceremonies. He taught his grandchildren the stories, the language, the ways of thinking that made them Lakota. And he told them about the forbidden fire, about the night he broke sacred law and was forgiven because the highest law was the preservation of the people. He told them this not to encourage rebellion, but to encourage thinking, to help them understand that blindly following rules was not spirituality, that true wisdom required evaluating each situation, each choice, each moment on its own terms. In 1912, at age 67, Eagle Feather died, surrounded by family in a small house on the Pine Ridge Reservation. The world he departed was unrecognizable from the one he had been born into. The buffalo were gone. The open plains were fenced and farmed. The Lakota lived under laws written by strangers in a language most elders did not speak. But his story survived. His grandchildren told it. Their children told it. It became one of those teaching stories that passes through generations, changing slightly with each telling but keeping its essential truth intact. Every August 28th, some Lakota communities light memorial fires. Small flames, nothing like the massive signal fires of 1865, but deliberate acts of remembrance. They light them to remember the night Eagle Feather chose life over rigid law, to remember the 12 grandfathers who died at Wolf Creek Canyon, to remember that adaptation is not betrayal, that preserving the people sometimes requires breaking the rules that were written to protect them. The fires burn for a few hours and then are allowed to die, their light visible to anyone who knows where to look and why it matters. The story's resonance extends beyond historical interest. In contemporary Lakota communities, Eagle Feather's choice remains relevant to ongoing debates about cultural preservation versus practical survival. How much tradition can you modify before it stops being tradition? How do you honor ancestors while living in a world they could not have imagined? These are not abstract questions. They are daily struggles for people trying to maintain native identity while navigating modern American society. Eagle Feather's Forbidden Fire offers a framework, though not an easy answer. It suggests that the purpose of tradition is to serve life, to support the people, to create meaning and connection. When tradition becomes an obstacle to those goals, wisdom requires re-evaluation, not abandonment, not mindless change, but thoughtful adaptation guided by core values rather than rigid rules. In the end, what makes Eagle Feather's story powerful is not that he had an easy choice. It is precisely because his choice was so difficult, so costly, so spiritually agonizing that it matters. He did not break sacred law casually. He did it with prayer, with fear, with full knowledge that he might be cast out forever. That weight, that genuine spiritual crisis, gives his action meaning. It transforms his decision from simple pragmatism into something more profound, a teaching about courage, about taking responsibility for your choices even when the consequences might destroy you, about understanding that sometimes the most sacred act is the one that looks like sacrilege until you understand the context. 800 lives saved by one forbidden fire, 12 grandfathers who bought ours with their own deaths, a young scout who became an elder teaching wisdom through his own moment of rule-breaking. This is not a story about rebellion, it is a story about judgment, about developing the wisdom to know when rules serve their purpose and when they become obstacles to the very things they were meant to protect. Every generation faces these questions. Every individual confronts moments when the right path is not the easy one, when the rules do not quite fit the situation, when you have to choose between what you have always been taught and what the moment demands. Eagle Feather chose. He lived with that choice. He was forgiven for it. And he spent the rest of his life helping others understand that spirituality is not about rigid adherence to law. It is about preserving what matters most. Sometimes, that preservation requires you to break the very rules that were written to protect it. The fire burns, the people survive, and the story carries forward, lighting the way for those who face their own impossible choices in their own dark nights.